The station called Velar's Cradle sat between two stars, and it was the kind of place that made most people feel very small. Its corridors were tall and carved from pale stone mined out of a dead moon. The lights were soft and golden. The air smelled like something between metal and rain. Ships from a dozen different civilizations were docked at its ports on any given day, and the halls were always full of delegates, soldiers, traders, and spies, moving in every direction. Corporal Owen Reeves had never been anywhere like it in his life. He stood near the entrance of the main hall with a duffel bag over one shoulder and a cup of instant coffee in his hand. He was not particularly tall. He was not broad or decorated or impressive in any way that this station would have recognized. His uniform was clean, his brown hair was short, and his face was the kind of calm that some people mistook for boredom. He had a habit of looking at things a little longer than most people were comfortable with. He had been told this many times. He had never seen it as a problem. He had been told this morning that he was being assigned as a personal liaison to a Sailori princess. He had finished his coffee before asking any questions. His commanding officer had taken that as a good sign. The Sailori were one of the oldest civilizations in the known galaxy. They had been sailing between stars before humans had figured out how to sail the sea. Their empire covered dozens of star systems, and their entire culture was built on ceremony, rank, and tradition so deep and so old that breaking even a minor rule was treated like a direct personal insult. They wore armor to diplomatic events. Their speech was formal and layered, and they expected the same from anyone standing in the same room as them. Earth had been part of the Galactic Accord for 30 years. Most alien civilizations still considered humans a young species, loud, short-lived, and not entirely predictable. The Sailori held this opinion with great politeness, which somehow made it sit worse than if they had just said it plainly. Owen did not spend much time thinking about any of that. He was led into a wide reception chamber by a Sailori attendant who walked with perfect posture and spoke in a voice that never shifted tone. The room was full of Sailori in formal dress. Their armor was silver and deep blue, layered in a way that looked almost like folded wings from a distance. They stood in straight, precise lines. None of them looked directly at Owen, though most of them clearly noticed him standing there with his bag and his empty coffee cup. At the far end of the room, seated on a raised chair that was not quite a throne, but was making a serious effort to be one, was Princess Kalis Vor Sailori. She was tall. All Sailori were tall, with pale gray-blue skin and amber-colored eyes that caught the light like glass. Her armor was more decorated than the others in the room, with markings along the collar that Owen had been briefed meant she was the third heir to the imperial throne. She sat very straight and looked at him the way a person looks at a piece of furniture that has been delivered to the wrong room. The ceremony began. A senior official read aloud from a long scroll in a language Owen did not fully speak. A small translator pressed near his ear converted the words in a quiet whisper. He learned that this rite was called the Veil Kora, the Oath of Proximity. Under Sailori law, it meant he was now her shadow. He was expected to be present wherever she was, to act in her interest, and to never leave her side without formal release. Abandoning a royal under the Veil Kora was considered a capital offense in Sailori culture. Owen nodded when he was supposed to nod. He said the required words in the broken Sailori he had practiced on the transit ship for 4 days. The hall gave a low sound that the translator told him was the sound of formal acceptance. Nobody smiled. Kalis did not speak once during the ceremony. She watched him with the same flat, measuring expression the entire time. When it ended, she rose, inclined her head by exactly the required degree, and walked out of the room without looking back. Owen was shown to his quarters. The room was comfortable and well furnished, with a wide window that looked out into open space. He set his bag down, looked at the view for a long moment, then went and sat in the corridor just outside. The room was too quiet, and he had never slept well in rooms that were too quiet. A young Sailori aide found him sitting against the wall an hour later, drinking from a second cup of coffee he had somehow produced from his duffel bag. The aide stared at him for a long, uncertain moment, then asked, in careful human standard language, whether something was wrong with the room. Owen told him the room was perfectly fine. He just liked sitting where he could hear the station move. The aide left quickly. He filed a report about it. 2 days went by. Owen moved through the station without hurry, learning the layout of the corridors, watching how the Sailori staff operated, noting which areas were busy and which ones were not. He ate in the communal halls and drew stairs every single time. He was the only human on the station. He did not appear bothered by this in any way that anyone could detect. On the second night, Kalis found him on the observation deck. She walked toward him with the posture of someone who had decided to do something uncomfortable and intended to get through it as fast as possible. She told him plainly that the Veil Korra was a political formality. She had no use for a human following her through the halls of a diplomatic station. He was free to move as he wished and occupy himself as humans apparently did. Owen listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "I go where you go, Your Highness. That's the deal." She looked at him. "I have just told you it is not necessary." "I heard you," he said. She studied him for several seconds, searching his face for the angle he was working. There was no angle. He looked back at her with that steady, unhurried gaze, and simply waited. She left without another word. 3 days after that, the intelligence reports started coming in. The Dravarai Collective, an empire that had been pressing against Sailori borders for years, had positioned warships in places that no routine patrol could explain. The voices in the diplomatic halls dropped lower. People began walking faster without seeming to realize it. On the fourth morning, Kalis appeared at Owen's door before the station's simulated dawn had even started. She told him to prepare to move. They were going to the front lines. She said it the way people say things that are not open for discussion. Owen looked at her. Then he looked at the half-finished cup of coffee on the table beside him. He picked it up, drained it, set the cup down, and reached for his bag. "Then I'd better pack light," he said. Kalis said nothing, but as she turned to walk away, something shifted briefly behind her amber eyes, too fast to name and too careful to show. Then it was gone, and her face was formal and closed again, and she was walking down the corridor with her armor catching the soft gold light of the station around her. The war front was nothing like the station. Velar's cradle had been grand and still and full of ceremony. The Sailori Fleet Assembly Point, deep in the Oran border system, was noise and heat and the constant low vibration of engines that never fully stopped. Ships moved in every direction. Supply runs came and went in tight, fast cycles. Officers talked in short bursts over open channels. The air inside the flagship smelled like charged metal and burned fuel, and something Owen could not name that he suspected was the particular stress scent of a species preparing for war. Kalis was a different person out here. On the station, she had been stiff and ceremonial, every word measured, every gesture calculated for rank and impression. Here, she moved through the bridge of her flagship, like someone who had been built for exactly this. She made decisions fast and without hesitation. She spoke to her officers in clipped, direct terms. She reviewed battle maps for hours at a time, without sitting down. Her generals listened to her without question, and not simply because she was royalty. They listened because she was right, and she had been right enough times that everyone in that fleet knew it. Owen watched all of this from whatever corner of the room he had been quietly assigned to. He had been given a modified sidearm, recalibrated for human hand size because Sailori weapons were built longer, and been told politely but without much warmth by Kalis's head general, a lean older officer named Commander Yale Voris, that his best contribution would be to stay out of the way and not touch anything. Owen had said, "Understood." He was not in a hurry to prove anything. He watched, he listened, he took notes in a small paper notebook he carried in his chest pocket. Actual paper, which several Sailori crew members found deeply confusing. He studied their battle formations, their communication patterns, the way they moved in tight corridors under pressure. He was not trained in Sailori doctrine and had no intention of pretending otherwise. But he was very good at watching people work and understanding what they were actually doing versus what they thought they were doing. The first major engagement came 6 days after their arrival at the front. A Dravhari fleet had broken through the outer Sailori patrol line and was pushing hard toward the colony world of Saildura, a planet of long crystalline plains and deep rock formations, home to over 2 million Sailori civilians. The flagship's bridge became very loud very fast. Orders moved in every direction. Battle formations shifted on the central display in real time. Owen was strapped into a crash harness on the rear wall of the bridge, which was where Voris had pointed when she told him to get out of the crew's path. He watched the engagement unfold on the displays from there, the Dravhari ships coming in hard and fast, the Sailori fleet responding in layered patterns he was only beginning to understand. The flagship took 2 hits from long-range fire that shook the entire hull. Alarms sounded. Someone near the front of the bridge was shouting damage reports faster than the translator in Owen's ear could keep up. He felt his stomach turn once, sharply, and then something in him went very calm and very focused. He pulled out his notebook and started writing. The naval battle broke in the Sailori's favor after about 2 hours, but the Dravhari ground forces had already reached the surface of Saildura. 3 days later, Kalis led a contingent down to the planet to reinforce the ground defense. Voris gave him the same look she always gave him and told him again to stay close to the rear formation. He did, for about 40 minutes. The rear formation was moving through a long crystal ravine when the ambush hit. Dravhari units came from the high ground on both sides, firing down with weapons that shattered the crystal formations into blinding sprays of fragments. The Sailori soldiers went to ground fast and in good order, but the ravine was a trap. Every angle of return fire was blocked. The unit was pinned and unable to move. Owen had already stopped listening to the order about the rear formation. He had been watching the ravine walls for the past 10 minutes, while everyone else was watching the path ahead. He had noticed a collapsed section about 60 meters back, where the crystal had fallen in a way that created a low, broken corridor running parallel to the ravine, just wide enough for one person moving on their hands and knees. He went into it without telling anyone. He came out on the far side of the ambush position, below and behind the Dravhari unit on the right flank, from an angle that their positioning had never accounted for, because no one in their command structure had apparently considered that someone would crawl through 40 meters of broken crystal rubble in the dark to get there. He hit their flank with what he had. It was not elegant. It was not by any military doctrine that the Sailori taught or the Dravhari had prepared for. It was improvised, noisy, and worked exactly well enough to break the ambush formation and give the pinned Sailori unit a window to move. In the chaos of the flank breaking, he dragged 2 wounded Sailori soldiers back through the collapsed section with him. One of them was nearly twice his body weight. He managed it anyway, though not without considerable difficulty and a great deal of pain to his shoulder that he chose not to mention. That night, in the field command post on the surface of Saildura, Kalis reviewed the engagement data from the body cameras her soldiers wore. She watched Owen's footage in silence, and watched it again. Then she set the display down and was quiet for a long time. Later, she passed Owen in the corridor outside the command room. She stopped. She looked at him, at the scrape across his jaw, at the way he was holding his left shoulder slightly too still. She said, "Owen Reeves." It was the first time she had used his name. Not the human. Not the liaison. His name. "Your Highness," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she walked on. It was not much, but Owen had spent enough time watching people to know what it meant. 2 weeks later, the war shifted. The Dravhari launched a massive push through the Sailori left flank, collapsing 3 border systems in 4 days. Kalis was ordered to take a strike force deep into Dravhari-controlled space and destroy a critical command relay that was coordinating the entire enemy advance. Without it, the Dravhari could not hold their push together. With it, they would break through to the core Sailori systems within a month. It was a mission with a very clear objective and a very poor chance of the people on it coming back whole. Owen had already started reviewing the mission parameters when the communication came in. It arrived on a secured Earth channel, direct from Galactic Affairs Command, back home. His name, his rank, his assignment code. In order to report to the nearest Earth extraction point within 6 hours. His presence at the front was being used by Dravhari diplomats as a political argument. They were claiming Earth was an active combatant in a war it had no standing in, and that his position was being used to push for sanctions against humanity's seat in the Galactic Accord. He was to leave immediately. No discussion, no delay. Owen sat with that communication for a long time. Kalis found out through Voris. She came to find him in the corridor outside the crew quarters, and for the first time since Velar's cradle, she did not look certain. She looked like someone standing at the edge of something they had not expected to be standing at. She did not beg. She did not command. She asked him, quietly, in a voice that had more layers in it than she probably intended, whether he was going to go. He looked at the floor between them. He looked at her. The corridor was empty, and the ship was humming quietly around them, and there was nothing diplomatic or formal about any of it. By morning, his quarters were empty, and the extraction point had logged a single human departure. Kalis stood in the corridor outside his empty room for a moment. Then she turned, walked to the bridge, and began preparing her strike force for the most dangerous mission of her life. She did not speak his name again. The soldiers on the flagship said the human had run. They said it quietly, in the way people say things they are not entirely sure are true, but want to believe because the other explanations are more complicated. They said that humans were young and soft, and that the war had been too much for him. They said the Veil Korra had been a political ceremony and nothing more, and that what happened was expected, and that it was a lesson in why humans could not be trusted with sacred oaths. Kalis said nothing. She studied her maps and ran her briefings and led her strike force out toward Dravhari space, and she did not speak about Owen Reeves at all. What none of them knew was that Owen Reeves had not gone home. He had reported to the extraction point exactly as ordered. He had signed the departure log and walked to the docking bay and sat down in the transit shuttle that was taking him back to Earth-controlled space. Then he had picked up his bag, walked off the shuttle, and gone in a completely different direction. The shuttle departed without him. The departure log showed him as extracted. No one checked further. He reached a small, poorly lit station on the outer edge of Sailori space 2 days later, a place called Port Ivan that existed mostly to serve traders who preferred not to have their cargo inspected. He paid for a room in a section of the station where nobody asked names, and he sat down and made a call. The call reached a secured channel that officially did not exist. The voice that answered belonged to Colonel Nate Briggs, a lean, gray-haired Earth intelligence officer who ran operations so deep off the record that most people at Galactic Affairs Command would have claimed not to know his name. He was based out of a black site facility on a station near the border, the kind of facility that did not appear on any public map. Owen told Briggs what he needed. Briggs was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You understand that if this goes wrong, Earth cannot acknowledge you in any way." Owen said he understood. Briggs said, "And you understand that it will probably go wrong." Owen said he understood that too. Another pause. Then Briggs said, "I'll have Dana pull the grid schematics for the relay. You'll have them in 6 hours." He paused one more time. "Owen, you're missing 2 fingers if this goes the way I think it's going to go." Owen said he would try to keep his fingers. The signals officer, Dana Flores, was 29 years old, sharp-eyed, and almost entirely sleepless for the 3 days that followed. She worked out of the black site facility with Briggs, running transmissions through channels that went nowhere on any Dravhari scanner, because the frequency had been built by a 19-year-old engineering student at a university in Ohio during a late-night project that no one had bothered to classify, which meant no one had ever bothered to look for it. Dana pulled every piece of data she could find on the Dravhari command relay: its position, its defensive grid, its patrol schedules, the shift rotations of its security personnel. She routed it in fragments to a deep space drop point that Owen would pass through on his route. She told Briggs on the second night, "He's going to get himself killed." Briggs told her that Owen knew that. Dana looked at her screen and kept working. Owen crossed into Dravhari-controlled space using forged travel credentials and a translation implant he had purchased from a vendor on Port Ivan, who did not ask what it was for. He boarded a Dravhari civilian cargo transport as a listed maintenance technician from a neutral system contracting firm. The credentials were good enough for the first 2 checkpoints. At the third, a border officer on routine patrol looked at him for a few seconds longer than the others had. The officer said something in Dravhari that the implant translated as, "You blink wrong." What followed was not graceful. Owen got clear of the officer and the checkpoint, using a combination of the station's ventilation layout, which he had memorized from Dana's schematics, and several techniques that his old combat instructor would have described as unacceptable and his mother would have described as uncivilized. He lost 2 fingers on his left hand to a closing pressure door he did not clear quite fast enough. He wrapped the hand with material from his jacket, took a breath, and kept moving. He spent 4 days aboard the cargo transport, working the maintenance rounds he was listed for, and spending his rest hours in a narrow utility corridor, feeding observations back through the buried subspace channel in small, compressed packets. He mapped the relay's external defense grid by watching it from the transport's cargo bay windows during scheduled approach runs. He timed the patrol intervals. He noted the blind spots in the coverage pattern. There were 3 of them, and they existed because whoever had designed the grid had clearly never considered that someone might approach from the direction of the relay's own supply chain. The data went out in pieces. Dana received it on the other end, and assembled it the way a person assembles a puzzle in the dark, carefully, without being certain of the final picture until the last piece arrived. When the last piece came in, she looked at what she had. She checked it against everything she knew about Dravhari defense architecture. Then she built a targeting package out of it, clean, precise, and confident in a way that military intelligence almost never was. She tagged it with the simplest source marker she could use without pointing directly at Owen's operation. She routed it through 4 separate dead-drop channels across neutral space, and the last leg of the route landed it on the desk of Commander Yael Voris. Voris was at the Sailori forward base, 3 days out from the relay strike. She looked at the package. She looked at the source tag. Origin unknown. Confidence level absolute. She pulled the packet's base metadata and ran a scan on the encryption signature buried underneath it. The scan came back with a result she read twice before she believed it. Human encryption. old military issue, the kind of encoding standard that Earth's forces had been using since before humans had ever heard of the Sailori. She took the package to Kalis without a word of introduction. Kalis read it. She looked at the targeting coordinates. She looked at the patrol window the data identified, a gap in the relay's coverage that would exist for exactly 11 minutes during the next rotation cycle, long enough for a fast strike force to slip through without triggering the outer grid. She looked at the metadata. She looked at the human encryption signature. She looked at it again, and then again after that, and her face was completely still in the way faces go still when the thing happening behind them is very large and moving very fast. She said nothing. She folded the data card and kept it, and she went to bed that night and did not sleep, and in the morning she briefed her strike force on the updated approach vector and told them they would move on the next cycle rotation. Nobody asked where the coordinates had come from. They were too good to question. The strike was clean. Kalis's force slipped through the 11-minute gap in the relay's coverage grid, exactly as the targeting data had described. The outer defense net did not respond. The patrol ships did not move. The strike force reached the relay in perfect positioning and hit it from 3 angles simultaneously. The structure failed completely within 4 minutes, and the Sailori force was already withdrawing before the Dravhari response units had finished scrambling. The Dravhari advance collapsed within a week. Without the relay coordinating their push, the fleet movements fell out of sync. Supply lines broke. 3 of their forward positions fell back in quick succession. The Sailori fleet hit each gap hard and fast, and the war that had looked like it might run for 2 more years was over in less than a month. Terms were negotiated at a neutral station, and the Sailori Empire received favorable conditions on every major point because they were the ones doing the negotiating from a position of strength. The celebrations were loud and long. Sailori victory ceremonies were elaborate by any standard, and this one was more elaborate than most. The entire empire was making noise. Kalis attended none of it. She submitted her final campaign reports. She briefed her officers on the transition to peacetime operations. She authorized the fleet's return rotation. She did all the required things in the right order and at the right time, and then she sent a communication through formal Sailori diplomatic channels to Earth's Galactic Affairs Command. The communication was short. It requested the immediate presence of Corporal Owen Reeves at Valar's cradle. It was phrased as a request, but it was written in the register of Sailori formal address that in practice meant the same thing as a summons. Earth's Galactic Affairs Command scrambled. Owen was officially listed as returned from deployment and currently on medical leave. He was located at a small recovery facility on a station near Kepler 22b. The facility confirmed he was there, that he was recovering from a hand injury, and that he was in the middle of eating something from a container when the priority communication reached him. He was told to report to Valar's cradle immediately. He asked no questions. He put down the container, picked up his bag, and went. He arrived at the station 3 days later. The docking bay where his shuttle came in was lined on both sides by Sailori honor guard in full ceremonial armor, deep blue and silver, standing completely still. Owen stepped off the shuttle with his bag over his good shoulder and his bandaged left hand at his side, and looked at the 2 rows of tall armored aliens waiting for him. He asked the nearest one, in a quiet voice, whether he was being arrested. The honor guard did not answer. They turned and walked, and Owen followed them, because there was nothing else to do. He was led to the grand reception hall at the center of the station, the same hall where the Veil Kora ceremony had taken place months before. The room was full. Sailori in full formal dress filled the space from wall to wall. Senior military officers stood in rows along the sides. Political officials stood near the front. The ceiling was high and lit in warm gold, and the room was completely silent when Owen walked through the doors. He was still in his patched travel uniform. His bandaged hand was held carefully against his side. He had not slept well on the transit ship, and it showed in his face. Every person in the room was dressed in their finest, and he walked among them, looking exactly like himself, which was to say, not like any of it. At the far end of the hall, on the raised dais where a seat had been set for formal proceedings, stood Kalis. She was in full Imperial armor. Every marking of her rank was displayed. She looked like the third heir to an ancient and powerful empire, which she was, and she stood perfectly still and watched him cross the room toward her. Then she did something that was not part of any Sailori ceremony. She stepped down from the dais. A sound moved through the hall, not quite a gasp, but something close to it. This was not how it was done. A royal did not descend toward a lesser. A royal waited and received. The senior lore-keeper near the back of the room looked briefly as though he might faint. Kalis walked to the center of the hall floor and stopped. She was taller than him by half a head, and she looked at his bandaged hand for a long moment, and then she looked at his face. The hall was so quiet that the distant hum of the station's engines was the only sound. She had planned what to say. She had composed it carefully over the weeks since the relay strike. Formal phrasing, the correct register, the right words for a public proceeding. She had reviewed it several times. It had been the right kind of words. She did not say any of them. What came out was quieter, less composed, the kind of thing that gets past careful people when the moment is more real than they had prepared for. "Did you forsake me, human?" It was not only an accusation. It had too many other things in it: relief and anger, and something that had been sitting in her chest for a long time and had not had anywhere to go. The hall heard all of it, whether she intended that or not. Owen looked at her for a long moment. He did not rush the moment. He did not try to fill it with explanation or apology or anything diplomatic. He just stood there and looked at her, that steady, unhurried look of his, and then he reached into the front pocket of his patched jacket. He pulled out a small data chip. He held it out and placed it in her hand. She looked down at it. It was a standard format chip, worn at the edges, the kind used for intelligence operations. She looked back up at him. He said, "Ask Commander Voris what that is." Voris was present. She was standing near the left side of the hall with the other senior officers, and every person in the room turned to look at her when Owen said her name. Voris stood very still for a moment. Then she straightened and met Kalis's eyes, and the look on her face was not the look of someone who did not know what was on that chip. Kalis looked at the chip in her hand. She looked at Owen. He was not nervous. He was just waiting, the way he always waited, patiently, with that particular stillness that had confused her from the very first day. She closed her hand around the chip. Around them, the grand hall held its breath. Commander Yael Voris walked to the center of the hall, and she did not look at the floor once. She had the posture of someone who had decided to tell the truth completely, and was prepared to accept whatever came after it. She stood beside Owen and faced the gathered hall, and she spoke clearly and without any of the careful softening that official reports usually carried. She told them about the data package. She told them it had arrived at the forward base 3 days before the relay strike, routed through 4 separate dead-drop channels across neutral space, carrying targeting coordinates of a precision that no Sailori intelligence team had been able to produce in 6 weeks of trying. She told them that the source was tagged as unknown, but that the encryption buried in the metadata was human, old Earth military encoding, not used in any official capacity, the kind of signature that only appeared when someone was working entirely off the record. Then she told them the rest. She had spent the week since the war's end piecing together what she could find, using contacts she had quietly built with a certain Earth intelligence officer who had been very selective about what he confirmed and what he did not. Owen had not gone home. He had gone into Dravari space, alone, without orders, without authorization, and without anyone on the Sailori side knowing he was there. He had spent days aboard a Dravari civilian transport, mapping the relay's defense grid from the inside, feeding data through a frequency that Dravari scanners had never been built to detect. He had been caught once. He had lost 2 fingers on his left hand in the process, and had kept working. The hall was completely silent while she spoke. Voris finished. She stepped back. The room sat with what it had just been given. The senior political officials near the front looked the way people look when they have said something dismissive about someone in public, and have just been shown, in front of a very large audience, exactly how wrong they were. Several of the military officers were looking at Owen with an expression that was much harder to describe, something between professional respect and the particular unsettled feeling of watching someone do something that should not have worked, but did. Kalis read the chip. She had a small reader in her palm. She had brought it because some part of her had known she might need it. The chip held a full record of everything Voris had described, documented in the clipped and careful language of a signals officer who had been awake for 3 days and was absolutely precise about every detail. It included the fragment transmissions Owen had sent, time-stamped and sequenced. It included the note Dana Flores had logged when the final piece of data came in, which said simply, "Complete. Package ready. She owes him something when this is over." Kalis read it once. Then she looked up at Owen. His expression had not changed. He was standing with his bag still over his shoulder, because he had not been given anywhere to put it, and he looked like someone who had shown up to a formal occasion without being told it was formal, and had long since stopped being bothered by that. The senior lore-keeper of the hall, an old Sailori in deep blue robes, who was responsible for interpreting matters of sacred law, had been consulting a small text since Voris finished speaking. He came forward now and delivered his finding in a thin, slightly trembling voice, because he had been a lore-keeper for 40 years and had never delivered a finding quite like this one. A Veil Korra, he said, required the Shadow to never abandon the Royal's cause, not to stay physically present at all times, but to never turn away from the obligation of her protection and interest. He had reviewed the record. He found no evidence that Corporal Owen Reeves had ever done so. He had pursued it by a route that no Sailori law had anticipated, through means that no Sailori doctrine had written rules for, from a direction that no one had fought to guard against. The oath, the lore-keeper concluded, had not been broken. The room exhaled. Then Kalis looked at Owen and asked him to speak. He looked around the room for a moment. He was not a man who had ever been comfortable with ceremony, and being asked to address a full Sailori formal gathering was the kind of thing that made most humans want a place to sit down. He stood where he was and looked at the floor briefly, the way he did when he was organizing his thoughts without making it obvious. Then he looked up and said 4 things, one after another, plainly and without decoration. I went where she needed me to go. I did what she needed done. Nobody gave me permission. I didn't ask for it. He said nothing after that. Those 4 sentences moved through the hall the way things move through a room when they land differently than anyone expected. The Sailori political officials looked at each other. The military officers stood a little straighter. The lore-keeper, very quietly, wrote something down. Those 4 sentences were eventually recorded in the Sailori Imperial Archive. Not in the military section. In the section reserved for things that changed how the Sailori understood a thing they thought they already knew. Later, after the formal proceedings had ended, after the officials had filed out, and the officers had been dismissed, and the honor guard had stood down, Kalis found Owen on the observation deck. She had looked in 3 other places first, out of principle. He was sitting against the curved window, with his good hand resting on his knee, and his bandaged hand held loosely in his lap, looking out at the stars, the same way he had looked at them from this same deck on the very first night. She crossed the deck and sat beside him, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Then she asked him, "What would you have done if the data had not reached us in time?" He thought about it. "Gone in myself, I guess." She looked at his profile. "That would have been suicide." "Probably," he said. Another silence, longer than the first. "You are a very strange creature, Owen Reeves," she said. Her voice was quiet, and whatever formality it usually carried had been set aside entirely. He almost smiled. "Yeah, we get that a lot." "After a while," she said, "when the Siluri first looked at your species, we thought your short lives made you reckless, that you moved quickly because you did not understand the weight of things." She paused. "We were wrong." Owen did not answer immediately. He was looking at the stars the way he always did, like they were somewhere he had not been yet, like they were something to move toward. "We move quickly," he said, "because we know the weight of things." She was quiet after that. Far away from Valar's cradle, in a briefing room on a neutral accord station near the galactic core, a Siluri diplomatic envoy was presenting the war's aftermath to a full session of the Galactic Accord. Senior delegates from 31 civilizations were present. The debrief covered the Dravari withdrawal, the terms of the peace agreement, and the factors that had led to the Siluri victory. One delegate, a senior official from the Miraf consortium, who had never found much to admire in humanity, raised a point of inquiry. He noted that the decisive targeting data for the relay strike had carried a human encryption signature. He asked how that data had been produced, and how it had arrived in Siluri hands. The envoy looked at her notes. She looked up. "A human sent it," she said. "From inside Dravari space?" the delegate asked. His tone made clear that he found this unlikely. "Yes," the envoy said. "How?" he asked. The envoy considered the question. She had reviewed the full record. She had read Voris's report, and the signals logs, and the lore-keeper's ruling. She had read Owen's 4 sentences, which had already been quietly circulating through Siluri diplomatic channels for 2 weeks. She folded her hands. "We are still determining the answer to that," she said. The delegate looked unsatisfied with this answer. Several others at the table exchanged glances. 2 of them, from civilizations that had made quiet dismissive comments about humanity at previous sessions, said nothing at all, and looked at the table in front of them. The question was never fully answered in any official record. That was, in its own way, an answer.